2BC. Thank you for joining me today. This is our first week of our summer study, and we're going to be diving into the books of Job and Ecclesiastes this summer. Let's go ahead and pray as we get started. God, I thank you so much for today, and I thank you that we can continue to gather together and open your word. I pray that as we dive into your word today, that you will speak to our hearts and just show us something. God, we love you. We pray all of this in Jesus' name. Amen. So as I said, today we are starting the book of Job. We are going to spend the next 7 weeks in Job, and then we're going to finish up the summer with looking at Ecclesiastes. So today I wanted to give a little bit of a background on the book of Job, and then we're going to dive into chapter 1 and go through a section there. So first off, the book of Job is, we don't know who wrote it. So there's no author that's really detectable from the text itself. So the author is anonymous. And we can learn a few things about this author. The author was highly educated, servant of God, and trained in the tradition of wisdom writing, like ancient Hebrew wisdom writing. And we can deduce from the way the author handles Job's story that perhaps this author, the one who wrote this down, has also been one who has suffered. So that's really what we can deduce about the author. We also don't know when it was exactly written down. So the date for the book of Job is a little bit hard to discern. Scholars kind of land in different places. Some put it having been written down during the post-exile period. Some say before the monarchy, so before 1000 BC. And so they just don't really agree on exactly when it was written down. But the story of Job reads a lot like the story of the patriarchs in Genesis, with some notable omissions. Usually whenever we have, like, say, the story of Abraham in Genesis, we have his whole family tree. We have all of his ancestors. Abraham was the son of so-and-so, who was the son of so-and-so, and goes all the way back. And we don't have that about Job. So Job starts off in verse 1, and it says that there was a man named Job, and that he lived in the land of Uz. And then we have a description of him. And so we're not really given any backstory. Job just kind of appears on the scene. And also, Uz is not, and also the land of Uz is unknown in the sense of where it is exactly. We're not really told, and people have posited different things. It just says that in verse 3, Job was the greatest man among all the people of the East. So somewhere east. That's about as specific as we can get. So we don't know exactly where. And that's okay. I think what this does, though, is it allows Job's story to be more universal. So we know that Job suffers, and we're going to see that as we get into the story today. But it allows his suffering, allows his experience to be every person's experience. So some of the other things that I wanted to point out about the book of Job before we get started is that the bulk of this book is poetry, but it starts with a short prologue and it ends with an epilogue, and both of those are in prose, so they're more told in like story format and a narrative format. So chapters 1 and 2 make up the prologue, and then all the way at the very end, which is chapter 42. I can't turn there very fast. My pages are sticking together. But that is the last part we have. It's a short epilogue, and it kind of concludes the story. And this prologue and epilogue gives us the actual backstory, the actual narrative part of Job's life. And then what we get in between is a series of dialogues, and those are told in a poetry format. It'll look similar to how the book of Psalms is laid out. And those dialogues take place in several cycles. We have Job's friends, and they have there's 3 friends who give speeches, and then actually there's a fourth person who also gives a speech. And then Job responds each time they speak. And we'll talk a little bit more about that next week when we get into the first of one of Job's first responses to his friends. And hold on, let me rephrase that. We'll get into that a little bit more next week when we read one of Job's responses to his friends. So I'm not going to dive too deeply, but I did want you to be aware that the book of Job is both prose and poetry, and a large part of it is poetry, and that's where we're going to be camping out a lot over the next 7 weeks. And finally, some of the themes we're going to see. We have the theme of suffering. Job is really asking the question, what do we do with the fact that people who seem to be, by all intents and purposes, be good people, who are faithful, what do we do whenever they are met with hard times, whenever they suffer? And in some ways, it seems to be an answer to the book of Proverbs, or a pendulum swing from the book of Proverbs. If you remember, we studied Proverbs last summer, and I would say that the going wisdom in the book of Proverbs is be obedient, be faithful, worship God rightly, and you're going to be blessed for it. Live life in a certain way, and it's going to equal a specific outcome of blessing. And if you live like the opposite way and do things in the wrong way, disobedient way, then you will be cursed and cut off. And that is definitely what we get a sense of as we read through the book of Proverbs. But then we have the book of Job, and it's the opposite pendulum swing. Well, what happens when bad things happen to those faithful people? People who are, for all intents and purposes, living their lives right before God. They are responding to God rightly, worshiping him, and attempting to follow him with everything they have. What do we do when those people fall on hard times and suffer? And is this God who we say God is just, and what kind of God is he? If we say God is just and he's good, but he lets this suffering happen, what do we do with that? So Job is really going to probe deeply and ask these questions. And we're going to talk some about that over the next several weeks. So we're going to go ahead and just start right here. We're going to read Job 1, and we're going to read verses 6 through 22, and we're going to meet Job, and we're going to see what happens to him here at the beginning in the prologue. And I'm going to be reading out of the NIV, so let's go ahead and read. One day, the angels came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came with them. The Lord said to Satan, "Where have you come from?" Satan answered, "The Lord, from roaming throughout the earth, going back and forth on it." Then the Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job? There is no one on earth like him. He is blameless and upright, a man who fears God and shuns evil." Does Job fear God for nothing?" Satan replied. "Have you not put a hedge around him and his household and everything he has? You have blessed the work of his hands, so that his flocks and herds are spread throughout the land. But now stretch out your hand and strike everything he has, and he will surely curse you to your face." The Lord said to Satan, "Very well then, everything he has is in your power, but on the man himself do not lay a finger." Then Satan went out from the presence of the Lord. And one day, when Job's sons and daughters were feasting and drinking wine at the oldest brother's house, a messenger came to Job and said, "The oxen were plowing and the donkeys were grazing nearby, and the Sabaeans attacked and made off with them. They put the servants to the sword, and I am the only one who has escaped to tell you." While he was still speaking, another messenger came. "The fire of God fell from the heavens and burned up the sheep and the servants, and I am the only one who has escaped to tell you." Excuse me. While he was still speaking, another messenger came and said, "The Chaldeans formed 3 raiding parties and swept down on your camels and made off with them. They put the servants to the sword, and I am the only one who has escaped to tell you." And while he was still speaking, yet another messenger came and said, "Your sons and daughters were feasting and drinking wine at the oldest brother's house, when suddenly a mighty wind swept in from the desert and struck the 4 corners of the house. It collapsed on them, and they are dead. And I am the only one who escaped to tell you." At this, Job got up and tore his robe and shaved his head. Then he fell to the ground and worshiped and said, "Naked I come from my mother's womb, and naked I will depart. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. May the name of the Lord be praised." In all this, Job did not sin by charging God with wrongdoing. So Job starts off with a bang. The part we didn't read talks about Job and all of his wealth and prosperity. We learned that in those first verses, the part we didn't read, it said we learned that Job was one who feared the Lord. He was blameless and upright and avoided evil. He had 7 sons and 3 daughters. This would have been considered an ideal family. He had sons and daughters, but he had more sons than daughters, which would have been looked favorably on in the ancient world. He had 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, and 500 donkeys, and many servants. And he had a lot of wealth. Camels possibly would have indicated he was involved in some sort of trading. Also, he had oxen, 500 oxen to plow his fields. That would have been it. Like, those oxen would have been able to plow a lot of fields. And he was just a very wealthy person. And so that is Job. He is very faithful, but he's also very wealthy. We learn in those first verses also that Job made a habit of making regular sacrifices to God for their sin, for his children's sin. So Job had an active relationship with God. And all of those things I think are very important for us to be able to understand what is going to happen in the rest of this book. So Job was not someone who was unaccustomed to God. So then where we started reading, we have this heavenly council, if you will, and it's very different, right? This is not something that we really read a whole lot about anywhere else in the Bible. And we have the angels coming to present themselves before the Lord. And then we have Satan here. And I wanted to point out here that Satan is actually a title. In Hebrew, it actually would be the Satan. It has the article, the definite article. This is more of a title, meaning adversary or accuser, more than connecting to our more modern and even the New Testament idea of Satan. And so we connect those two because of our experience, and we have the New Testament. But in the Old Testament here in Job, it's just the Satan. And the NIV takes out the article, but it is there in Hebrews. The Satan also came. So what we learn about Satan here is really not a whole lot. We learn that he is some sort of accuser and maybe with a bit of a troublemaker at this point. So he's presented as one who's going to and fro over the earth, and almost as if he is looking for someone who is being disloyal. And then he's coming and presenting that before God. And so the Lord is the one who brings up Job. And he says, "Have you considered my servant Job?" And I think it's so interesting because here God says that Job is blameless and upright, and he fears God and shuns evil. And God's opinion of Job is so important. I think it shows how active and vibrant Job's relationship with God was. It wasn't just lip service. There was a deep relationship there. But Satan says, well, he may be upright, but does anybody really do good just because it's good to do good? Don't they only do things if they get something in response? And it's like, you have protected Job. He has all of these blessings and his life is going pretty well. I bet you if he didn't have all of those things, he wouldn't want to worship you. And he would not be so upright and blameless. And I'm going to be honest, this has always been a bit of a disturbing scene for me. I'm like, oh my goodness. So Satan presents this challenge of, if you were to remove your hedge of protection, then Job's not going to worship you so much. Satan is presenting this notion that all good deeds, all good things come from selfish motives. And that's an age-old question. I mean, people have been asking that question for a long time. I'm even reminded of an episode on a really popular TV show where that was a question for one whole episode, is there really any unselfish good deed? So that's what Satan is asking here. And the Lord responds, well, okay, very well. Everything he has is in your power, but you can't do anything to hurt him. And so God responds and accepts the challenge. And then Satan goes out to be this instrument of testing. This is a very unique passage. We get this very unique picture of what's going on at a spiritual, heavenly level as Job is about to embark on this time of testing and suffering. And so Satan goes out, and we see the calamities come. And it's important to note here that we have calamities that are coming at the hands of other people and calamities that are coming at the hands of kind of like acts of nature. So we have fire and we have wind, but we also have groups of people, the Sabaeans and the Chaldeans. And it's almost like they're coming from all four directions, north, south, east, and west. And that these hostile forces are just coming at Job and his family and his possessions on all directions. And then particularly poignant is the end here when we get Job's response, this initial response to this suffering. So he tears his robe and he shaves his head and he falls to the ground in worship. And so he is definitely in mourning. He is grieving, but he responds with prayer, he responds with worship in this moment where he has gone from the wealthiest, greatest man in the East to a pauper, for lack of a better word, all in an instant, all in one afternoon is what it seems like, one day. And he responds with worship. And he responds with saying, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I will depart. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. May the name of the Lord be praised. He acknowledges God's sovereignty in this moment of his deepest grief that he had experienced up to this point. And he praised the Lord in sorrow and blessing. So we see that ongoing relationship. And I would say that Job wouldn't have been able to respond this way if he didn't already have that deep relationship with God. It says he did not sin by charging God with wrongdoing, by pointing out, oh God, it's just your fault. And so we see here in Job 1 that the Satan is already proved wrong, that Job did in fact love God and would worship God even when things were going poorly. And so what happens in the rest of the prologue in chapter 2, and I encourage you to read it because we're not going to go over it in our Sunday school curriculum, is Satan comes back to God and says, it's a very similar scene all over again. And God says, have you considered my servant Job? And he talks about all of the things about how he maintains his integrity, even though he had lost everything. And Satan responds that, well, but you wouldn't let me touch his life. So let me impact him specifically. He'll probably give up whenever that happens. And so then Job is struck with a disease. We don't really know exactly what it is, but it causes boils all over him. So in verse 2:7, Job is afflicted with painful sores on the soles of his feet to the crown of his head. And then Job is sitting in the ashes, scraping and itching himself with broken pottery. His wife comes to him and says, you should just curse God and die. And Job still says, shall we accept good from God and not trouble? And he says he still did not sin with what he said. His 3 friends come to him to sit with him, and they sit with him in the dust and the ashes for 7 days and 7 nights. And no one said a word to him because they saw how great his suffering was. And so we have, in the span of 2 chapters, this great man from the East go from being the greatest to being at the depths of despair, sitting in ashes, just in mourning and grief and suffering. So this begs the question for us, how do we respond when trials come? Are we only worshiping God for what we get out of it, for the good things we get out of worshiping God? Or are we worshiping God no matter our circumstance? We talked a little bit about this a couple Sundays ago on Senior Sunday, where we talked about when we find ourselves in those trail disappearing moments, are we stopping and praising God? Or are we letting our circumstances dictate how we respond to God instead of our response to God is dictating how we respond to our circumstances. And I think that's something that we see with Job. His relationship with God drove how he responded. And we'll see, he doesn't hold back. He asks some hard questions. He laments a whole lot. And he really wants God to explain what's going on and why and all of those things. So he doesn't hold back, and he's not just a pushover. He's not being inauthentic, but he does have a solid relationship with God that allows him to respond in worship and praise and trust in God's sovereignty, despite what's going on in his circumstances. So I encourage you to mull over that this week. We're going to be diving into some pretty hard topics about suffering in the world and how is God at work in the midst of that. So I encourage you to show up to your small groups, have good conversations, and I hope this will be a good study. All right, see you next week. Bye.